He showed up to his own daughter's wedding in work boots and a flannel shirt, and I remember thinking, this man has no idea what day it is. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything I thought I knew about Harlan Sykes in the first 3 hours I spent near him, but that particular wrongness, the work boots, the flannel, the way he sat in the front pew like he was waiting for a dental appointment. That one stuck with me the longest before I understood it. Let me tell you what I saw, and then let me tell you what was actually there. Vivian Cross had been my closest friend since the 3rd grade. We grew up 2 streets apart in Durango, Colorado, and when she called me in September to say she was getting married up in Telluride and would I please come be her maid of honor, I said yes before she finished the sentence. I had not met the groom, I had not met his father. I had not expected either of them to matter as much as they did by the time that weekend was over. The groom was a man named Thomas Sykes, and he was everything Vivian had described. Steady, quiet, attentive in the way that made you think he was actually listening and not just waiting for his turn to speak. I liked him immediately, but Thomas had mentioned, with a careful flatness in his voice that I noticed and filed away, that his father was coming down from the ranch outside Ridgeway, and that he hoped the drive wouldn't be too hard on him. Too hard on him suggested elderly, suggested fragile, suggested someone who needed accommodating. Harlan Sykes walked into that church like he owned the mountain it was built on. He was not elderly, he was not fragile. He was somewhere in his early 60s, built like a man who had spent 4 decades doing things that required his body to cooperate or suffer the consequences. With gray at his temples and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red sandstone as the canyon walls outside. He was wearing the flannel shirt. He was wearing the work boots. His hands, when he shook mine during the brief introductions before the ceremony, were the hands of someone who had never in his life done anything merely decorative. He said, "You're Vivian's friend." Not a question, a fact he was confirming. I said I was. He nodded and sat down. That was the whole conversation. I spent the ceremony watching him from the corner of my eye the way you watch something you can't quite categorize. He did not cry. He did not smile in the loose, undone way that fathers sometimes do when they watch their children get married. He sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on Thomas, and his expression was, I want to be precise about this, not cold. It was contained. Like a fire that had learned to burn without throwing sparks. At the reception I tried twice more to have a conversation with him. The first time I asked how long the drive from Ridgeway had taken. He said 3 hours. I waited for more. More did not come. The second time I asked if he had a toast prepared. He said he did not give toasts. Then he picked up his glass of water. Not wine, water, and walked toward the window that looked out over the San Juan Mountains and stood there with his back to the room. I turned to Vivian's mother, who was standing beside me, and I said quietly, "Is he always like that?" She said, "Like what?" I said, "Like he's somewhere else entirely." She looked at Harlan at the window and said, "Honey, that man is more present than anyone in this room. You're just not used to what present looks like on him." I did not understand what she meant. Not that night. What I understood that night was this. Thomas Sykes was marrying my best friend, and Thomas Sykes's father was a man who wore work boots to a wedding, refused to give a toast, and appeared to have the emotional range of the red rock formations visible through the reception hall window. I was not hostile to Harlan Sykes. I was simply certain, with the confidence of someone who had spent 15 years as a social worker reading people for a living, that I had read him correctly and completely within the first 3 hours. I was 37 years old, and I had never been more wrong about anything. I did not see Harlan again until the following April. Vivian and Thomas had settled in Montrose, close enough to the ranch that Thomas could help his father during calving season, and far enough that Vivian could keep her job at the hospital in town. I drove up for a long weekend in April, 7 months after the wedding, and on the Saturday afternoon Vivian said Thomas was going out to the ranch to help his father with something, and did I want to come along? I said sure, with the tone of someone who does not particularly mean it. The ranch outside Ridgeway was not what I had pictured. I had pictured something weathered and stubborn, the physical equivalent of the man who ran it. And it was weathered, yes, and the house was not large, and the fences needed paint in places. But the land itself was. I am not a person who uses the word breathtaking casually, and I am using it now. The land was breathtaking. The Cimarron Ridge ran along the eastern edge of the property, and the light at 4 o'clock in April came through the notches in the ridge in long, dusty columns and fell across the pasture, in a way that made the whole thing look like something you'd see behind glass in a museum. If museums could contain things that large. Harlan was in the near pasture when we pulled up, working on a section of fence that had come down in the winter. He had not heard the truck. He was on his knees in the mud, his back to us, doing something precise and unhurried with his hands, and he did not look up for a full 2 minutes after we got out. When he finally stood and turned and saw me, he said, "You came back." I said Vivian had invited me for the weekend. He said good, and went back to the fence. Thomas went to help him. Vivian and I walked the property for a while, and I watched from a distance the way the two of them worked. Father and son, very little talking. A kind of wordless coordination that looked like a language I didn't speak. Thomas would hand Harlan a tool before Harlan reached for it. Harlan would move to the next post without needing to explain that they were moving to the next post. It was the fluency of people who had spent years learning each other through work rather than through conversation. At some point I wandered closer, more out of curiosity than intention, and Harlan said without looking up, "Hand me that wire stretcher, orange handle." I found it and handed it to him. He said, "You know what you're looking at?" I said I did not. He explained the fence. Not in a way that suggested I was ignorant for not knowing. In a way that suggested the fence was interesting enough to be worth explaining to anyone who was paying attention. He told me why this particular section had failed, what the frost line does to fence posts in this elevation, why the cattle had pushed on this spot specifically and not the ones on either side. He talked the way someone talks when they have spent a great deal of time thinking about a thing and rarely get the chance to say any of it out loud. I listened because there was nothing else to do, and somewhere in the listening, I noticed that what I had taken for coldness at the wedding, the containment, the economy, the long silences, was not coldness. It was the behavior of a man who had learned over many years that most words are wasted, that if you wait long enough and watch carefully enough, you will understand more than talking ever showed you. He was not disengaged from the world around him. He was more engaged with it than most people I had ever met. He just engaged differently. He had been watching at that wedding. He had seen everything. He had simply chosen not to perform a reaction to it. I did not tell him any of this, but I stopped that afternoon composing the story I had written about him in my head. The story where he was difficult, closed off, the shadow behind his son's good nature. That story was not accurate, and I knew it, and I felt the small specific shame of someone who has been wrong in a way that reflects poorly on their judgment of themselves. We ate dinner at the ranch that night. Harlan cooked, not elaborately, just a pot of pinto beans with green chile that had been going since morning and cornbread from a cast iron pan that looked older than the state of Colorado. The food was extraordinarily good in the way that food is when someone has made it 100 times and stopped caring about impressing anyone with it. Vivian asked Harlan something about the ranch's history, and he talked for nearly 20 minutes. It was the most I had heard him speak. He talked about his father buying the land in 1961. About what it had been like to grow up here in the 70s when ranching was already starting to struggle. About the years after his wife died when Thomas was 11 and he had thought seriously about selling, and what had stopped him from selling. A morning in February when he had walked out to check on a mare that was about to foal, and the light was coming up over the Cimarron, and he had stood there for a long time and understood that this place was not an asset. It was a responsibility. That there were people who were supposed to come after him on this land, and that he was the only thing standing between them and its absence. He said this without sentiment. Just as a fact he had worked out and lived by ever since. I drove back to Montrose that night, sitting in the back seat while Thomas drove and Vivian talked. And I looked out the window at the dark shapes of the mountains, and thought about the story I had written about Harlan Sykes at that wedding and how completely I had missed the actual person. I had seen the boots. I had seen the flannel. I had seen a man who would not toast his son's marriage. And from those three things I had concluded, with the confidence of someone who should have known better, that I understood him, that I had categorized him correctly, that the container told me what was inside. I had done this before, not to Harlan Sykes specifically, but to the type of person I believed he was. The taciturn older man, the stubborn rancher, the father who shows up but doesn't show up. I had that folder in my head, and I had put him in it without looking at what I was actually putting away. The second time I visited Ridgeway I came alone. This was in August, 14 months after the wedding. Vivian and Thomas were in Telluride for their anniversary weekend, which I thought was a little funny, given where they'd gotten married. And I had the weekend free and the drive from Durango was only 2 hours, and I told myself I was going because I wanted to see the mountains in August. That was partially true. I called ahead. Harlan answered on the fourth ring and said, "Come if you want. There's plenty to do." Plenty to do turned out to mean, help move a herd of about 60 cattle from the north pasture to the south pasture, a process that took most of Saturday morning and involved considerably more shouting and considerably less dignity than I had anticipated. I had never worked cattle before. I made mistakes that an experienced person would not have made. Harlan corrected each one without commentary, just a word or two that told me exactly what to do differently, and moved on. At one point I let a group of about 8 steers break left when they should have gone right, and by the time we got them back the whole process had to restart from a certain point, and I braced myself for a reaction. Harlan looked at me and said, "First time is always a wreck, second time you'll know." That was it. We moved on. There is a particular quality of patience. Not the soft patience of someone who expects little, but the hard patience of someone who has done difficult things for a long time, and understands that difficulty is not a failure, it is just the nature of anything worth doing, and Harlan Sykes had it in a quantity I have rarely encountered. It was not warm patience, it was not reassuring patience. It was simply the presence of someone who was not going to waste energy being frustrated by the unavoidable. I had worked with people for 15 years. I thought I understood patience. Harlan Sykes made me understand that what I had called patience was often just tolerance, and that tolerance and patience were not the same thing at all. We ate lunch at the kitchen table without talking much, and then in the afternoon he said he was going to ride the upper fence line, and I could come if I wanted to. I said I wanted to. The upper fence line took us along the eastern edge of the property, where the land tilted up toward the ridge, and the pines started, and the air was 15 degrees cooler than the valley below. Harlan rode ahead and I followed, and he talked as we rode, not constantly but steadily, in the way I had come to recognize as his natural rhythm. He pointed out a pair of red-tailed hawks nesting in a Douglas fir near the property line. He explained why the aspens were growing in that particular pattern on the north-facing slope and not the south-facing one. He knew the name of every plant we passed, and not just the name, the use. Which ones the cattle avoided and why. Which ones indicated water below the surface. Which ones the Ute people had used for medicine, and which ones they had used to dye wool. He talked about the land the way some people talk about their children, with a knowledge so deep and specific that it could only come from decades of close attention. From getting up before dawn and going to bed after dark, and spending the hours between actually watching. At some point I asked him why he hadn't given a toast at Thomas's wedding. He rode for about 30 seconds before he answered. He said, everything I wanted to say to Thomas I'd already said, or I hadn't said it because it didn't need saying. Standing up in front of a room full of people to say it again seemed like it was for the room, not for him. I said, he might have wanted it. Harlan said he didn't, he knows how I feel. He's always known. The people who give toasts are usually trying to convince someone of something. I wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything. I thought about this for a long time. I thought about the folder I had made for Harlan Sykes at that wedding. The closed-off father, the shadow, the man who couldn't be bothered, and how the folder had been built entirely from his refusal to perform. His refusal to give the toast, to wear the suit, to cry in the way that was visible and legible to people who didn't know him. I had mistaken the absence of performance for the absence of feeling. I had confused what wasn't being shown with what wasn't there. He had felt everything at that wedding. He had felt it quietly by himself, in the way he apparently felt most things. Fully and privately, without requiring an audience. I said, I misjudged you at the wedding. He said, I know. I said, you knew? He said, you had a look, like you'd decided something. I said, I'm sorry. He rode another few paces. Then he said, don't apologize for it. You did what people do. You saw what was in front of you and you made a conclusion that's reasonable. The only thing that matters is whether you updated when you got more information. I said, I did. He said, then we're fine. That was the whole conversation about it. We rode back down to the ranch as the light went gold and long across the pasture, and I helped him with the evening feeding, and we ate dinner on the porch and watched the dark come up from the valley and fill in around the mountains until only the ridgeline was still lit, and then that too went dark. He said at some point, Thomas chose well. I said, he did. He said she's going to be good for this family. She's got a spine. I said Vivian had always had a spine. He said I know. I watched her at the wedding. Same as I watched you. I didn't ask what he had concluded from watching me. I thought maybe I didn't need to know. And I thought maybe from Harlan Sykes, being watched carefully was already a form of respect. I visited the ranch 4 more times over the following 2 years. Each time I stayed a little longer, and talked a little less, and learned a little more about what the land looked like in different lights and different seasons, and what it required from the people who were responsible for it. The 5th visit was not a visit I had planned. Thomas called me on a Tuesday evening in March and said his father had been taken to the hospital in Montrose with chest pains. Not a heart attack. They were clear about that. But something that needed monitoring, something about blockage, something that required him to stay for 3 days and undergo a procedure and spend those 3 days lying in a hospital bed doing nothing, which Sa said was going to be harder on Harlan than the procedure itself. I drove up Wednesday morning. I will tell you what I found when I walked into that hospital room. Harlan Sykes in a paper gown, connected to 3 different monitors, holding a paperback copy of a book about the geology of the Colorado Plateau that Thomas had apparently brought him, reading it with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and looking, I want to be exact again, not scared, not diminished, just profoundly impatient with the interruption. He looked up when I came in. He said, you didn't need to come. I said I wanted to. He looked at me for a moment, then he said, we sat there for most of the afternoon. He read. I read, we talked when there was something worth saying and didn't talk when there wasn't. A nurse came in to check his vitals, and he asked her a precise and surprisingly informed question about the specific medication they were giving him. And she blinked and said she'd get the doctor. And when the doctor came in, Harlan asked him 4 more questions that indicated he had spent the morning reading about his own condition with the same methodical attention he brought to fence repair and cattle management and the geology of the Cimarron Ridge. The doctor answered all 4 questions and then said, "Mr. Sykes, you are either a physician or a very difficult patient." Harlan said, "I'm a rancher, same skill set." I laughed before I could stop myself. It was the first time I had ever heard him make a joke, if it was a joke which I was not entirely certain of, and the surprise of it caught me off guard. He glanced at me when I laughed. Something in his face shifted slightly. Not a smile exactly. More like the suggestion of one in the same way the ridge outside the ranch suggested snow that hadn't fallen yet. Thomas and Vivian came in the late afternoon and we all stayed until visiting hours ended. In the elevator on the way down, Vivian said, "I've never seen him accept help from anyone." Thomas said, "He's not accepting help, he's tolerating presence, there's a difference." "Geez," Vivian said, "is there?" Thomas said with my father, "Yeah. Presence is what he asks for, he just doesn't ask with words." Harlan had the procedure Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon he was home. By Saturday he was out looking at his fence lines. Thomas told me not doing anything, just looking. Making sure everything was still where he'd left it. I thought about that image for a long time after. The man walking the perimeter of the thing he was responsible for, not yet able to work it, just needing to see it. To confirm that it was still there and still requiring him. That is devotion. Not the kind you put into words at a reception in front of a room full of people. The kind you put into getting up before dawn for 40 years because the thing you love needs you to. I had sat in that church in Telluride, and looked at a man in a flannel shirt and work boots and written a story about him in my head. The story was so complete and so confident that I nearly missed the actual man standing inside it. He never held it against me. He watched me update the story, the way he watched everything. Quietly, carefully, without requiring a performance of the process. And when I got it right, he just moved on. As if having initially been wrong was simply the entry cost of eventually getting it right. As if that was how all real understanding worked. Harlan Sykes taught me something that 15 years of professional training in reading people had not managed to teach me. That the most important thing is not the first read. The first read is almost always a shortcut, and shortcuts save time by cutting away the parts that matter most. The most important read is the one you do when you realize you were wrong. Whether you double down, or whether you actually look. I have thought about those work boots every time I have made up my mind about someone in the first 10 minutes of meeting them. Which is more often than I'd like to admit. And every time I try to remember what was inside the man who wore them, and that the man wearing them saved his son's marriage, in a way, just by letting me be wrong long enough to find out who he actually was. If this story stayed with you. If you've ever made up your mind about someone and later found out you couldn't have been more wrong. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. And if you want another story about a person who wasn't what they appeared to be, and what happened when someone was patient enough to find out the truth, it's right here waiting for you.